Today, we continue our look at the Jehovah's Witness publication, Revelation, its Grand Climax at Hand. Now that we know what scholars think about the authorship of Revelation and the genre of apocalyptic literature, we can start looking at Chapter 2 of this publication. Chapter 2 covers the JW belief that the Bible is telling a story, and that the theme of the story is mainly about Satan challenging Yahweh's sovereignty and attempting to derail Yahweh's plans for humanity, and how all of this will be resolved. To come to that belief, you need to ignore the fact that scholars have been well aware of for several centuries. The Bible does not speak with one voice and one opinion and one set of beliefs. It has many voices, opinions, and beliefs throughout its books. Even within one single book of the Bible, there can be different voices, and each book can have multiple authors and redaction layers. Many believers, including Jehovah's Witnesses, ignore this fact, try to find ways around it to produce apologetics, and employ eisegesis, the practice of interpreting text as to introduce one's own presuppositions to make contradictions and other problems go away. Let's look at paragraph 3 of chapter 2. It reads, "The Bible's first book, Genesis, tells of the beginning and describes God's creative works, including his crowning earthly creation, man. Genesis also sets out the first divine prophecy, uttered by God himself in the Garden of Eden some 6,000 years ago. A serpent had just been used to deceive the first woman, Eve. She in turn had persuaded her husband, Adam, to join her in violating Jehovah's law by eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. In passing judgment on the sinful couple, God said to the serpent, 'I shall put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He will bruise you in the head, and you will bruise him in the heel.' That prophecy sets the theme for the whole Bible, including Revelation. Briefly, note that they aren't claiming that the serpent is Satan here. They claim a serpent had been used. But this sentence is not supported by the text of Genesis. Never does Genesis state that the serpent is being used. It states that the serpent itself is doing the deceiving. This is seen by the fact that it calls the serpent shrewder than the other animals, implying that it has intelligence. And Yahweh later punishes the serpent, and all of its descendants, evidently, by removing its legs. If the serpent is simply a puppet, then why punish the serpent? For a wider view of the Eden story, please refer to our videos about the Tree of Life. The more important part of the story in this study is the so-called prophecy of Genesis 3, verse 15. It is true that many theologians have called this a prophecy, the proto-evangelium, or first gospel, in Christian tradition, but there are many different interpretations of what it is saying. Christians do not have a unified view of this verse. Jewish interpretation is closer to scholarly interpretation. There is no view that this is a messianic prophecy. It is simply a part of the story and tells us why snakes do not have legs and why snakes and humans can have quite a bad relationship. So, what do Jehovah's Witnesses believe about Genesis 3, verse 15? Paragraph 5 reads, "The prophecy of Genesis 3, verse 15 was addressed to the serpent that had lied to Eve, suggesting to her that she would not die for her disobedience, but that she would become independent, a goddess. The serpent thus made Jehovah out to be a liar and insinuated that humans could improve their lot by rejecting his supreme rulership. Jehovah's sovereignty was challenged and his good name besmirched. The idea that the serpent suggests that Eve could be a goddess or independent from God is a theological one, a prime example of eisegesis. When we actually read the Eden story, we see a different picture. What the serpent actually suggests is, for God knows that in the very day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and bad. And what God admits is, here the man has become like one of us in knowing good and bad. As God confirms that what the serpent said would happen did actually happen, the serpent did not lie to Eve in that sense. Being like God is not equivalent to being a god or goddess. In the context of what the serpent says, it is simply having a specific quality that God also possesses, to know good and bad. Again, see our Tree of Life videos for more details. Likewise, being like God is not being independent from God, and it is not a challenge to his sovereignty. There's a subtle undermining of God's word, but the text does not frame it as a cosmic rebellion or a formal challenge to divine authority. There are ways to bring other later texts from the Bible together to show that Satan rules the world, but this requires ignoring the scholarship on exactly who or what Satan is and how the character developed over time. Traditional Israelite theology placed all actions, good or bad, under divine control. There was no independent evil entity in ancient Israelite thought. In Job, we see a character whose title is the Satan, one of the divine council, whose role is like that of a prosecutor, not a rebel, and not a person called Satan. However, over the centuries, the Israelites were oppressed and exiled, even when sincerely trying to keep God's commandments, and this caused a shift in thinking. As Bart Ehrman puts it in his book, Heaven and Hell, there developed within Jewish thinking the idea that even though God is sovereign, there are other powers in the world, superhuman beings who are responsible for persecuting and harming God's people. It was in this period that some Jewish thinkers propounded the idea that God has a cosmic antagonist, the devil. To be sure, a figure known as the Satan does appear in a couple of places, most famously in the book of Job, but there he is not the devilish opponent of God. He is one of God's divine counselors who opposes humans, but who still does God's bidding. For later Jewish thinkers, however, this figure was transformed into a massively powerful being opposed to God and all who worship him. Paragraph 6 reads, "As for that term serpent, does it apply only to a literal snake? Not at all. Revelation identifies for us the infamous spirit creature that spoke through that snake. It was the great dragon, the original serpent, the one called Devil and Satan, who is misleading the entire inhabited earth, that seduced Eve by its cunning. However, as we previously noted, the text of Genesis does not support this. It does not call the serpent by the name Satan. It does not suggest that the serpent is a puppet of Satan. It indicates that the serpent itself has intelligence." We also now know that scholars trace the development of the concept of an evil being opposed to God and his followers, and show it to be a later development, not an original Israelite belief. In fact, some scholars see a connection with Persian or Zoroastrian belief. The Bible does not explicitly link the serpent in Genesis to Satan until the New Testament. In fact, the only plausible connections are made in Revelation itself. Even then, there is more evidence to suggest that Revelation is connecting Satan to Leviathan than to the serpent in the garden. Please see our Creation Stories playlist for more information. Other verses quoted from the Christian scriptures need to be seen through a Christian interpretive lens to reach the conclusion that they connect the serpent with Satan. Examples: "But I am afraid that somehow, as the serpent seduced Eve by its cunning, your minds might be corrupted away from the sincerity and the chastity that are due the Christ." And no wonder, for Satan himself keeps disguising himself as an angel of light. While indirect, many Christian interpreters combine verse 3 and verse 14 to suggest Paul may have seen Satan behind the Genesis serpent. "You are from your father the devil, and you wish to do the desires of your father. That one was a murderer when he began, and he did not stand fast in the truth, because truth is not in him. When he speaks the lie, he speaks according to his own disposition, because he is a liar and the father of the lie." Jesus refers to the devil as active from the beginning, which has been traditionally read by many Christians as an allusion to Genesis 3, though again, the connection is inferred, not explicit. So, the scholarly consensus is that Satan is neither the serpent nor a controller of the serpent in the garden. Hebrew Bible authors lived in an Israel that believed good and bad came from God, and that the Satan was simply one of God's divine counsel. However, later New Testament authors, living in an Israel that had been through cultural and theological changes, were now accustomed to connecting the serpent with an evil being known as Satan. Next time, we will look at the Jehovah's Witness doctrine of God's woman. Don't forget to see the description for more resources.